verses 5, 6, and 7. After this I looked, and in heaven the temple, that is the tabernacle of the testimony, was opened. Out of the temple came the 7 angels with the 7 plagues. They were dressed in clean, shining linen and wore golden sashes around their chest. Then one of the 4 living creatures gave to the 7 angels 7 golden bowls filled with the wrath of God, who lives forever and ever. Now I want you to notice that these angels are dressed in shining linen robes, and they have golden sashes around their chest. Sometimes we tend to forget that the Bible is just not putting these things in the Bible to make it sound good. No, if there's little details in the Bible, there's a reason for that. And so when it begins to describe their dress, I take notice of that. Now, why in the world does it tell us that they were dressed in shining linen robes and they had a golden sash around their chest? Because that type of dress had meaning. Linen was the fabric that the priest wore, and let me explain why. Linen is the fabric of choice in warm weather because it's cool in the summer and it breathes so it remains crisp and fresh even in extremely hot weather. And if you ever travel over to Israel during the months of June, July, August, or September, let me tell you, it's extremely hot. It's kind of like Oklahoma is in August. You know, when we start hitting those 100 days and the heat index gets up to about 110 to 115, that's the way it is in Israel. And so the priest who had to do all of this work for the Lord, they're busy working inside the temple. I'm going to tell you, they would get extremely hot. And so linen was the fabric of choice. Now, the interesting thing about linen is the more you wear it, the softer and the more supple it becomes. And that's why the priest wore it. You see, the priests were not supposed to sweat. Why were the priests not supposed to sweat? They weren't supposed to sweat because sweat represents work. Remember that one of the curses that came upon Adam was that he would have to earn his bread or work by the sweat of his brow. Sweat represents hard work, hard labor. Now, priests weren't supposed to sweat. And the reason they weren't supposed to sweat is because sweat represents work, and it's not by works that we're justified. It's by the sacrifice of the Lamb that we are justified. So as part of the symbolism of the sacrificial system, the priests weren't supposed to sweat. That's why they wore linen. So these angels are dressed in linen. In other words, they are dressed like priests. And what does that tell us? These angels minister in the presence of God. These aren't just any angels. These aren't the angels that normally come upon the earth and they're our guardian angels. They're not sent out by God to do things normally. Their job is to minister in the temple in the presence of God. Wow. They're also wearing a golden sash around their chest. A golden sash symbolized royalty or an extremely elevated status. So these aren't just any angels, these are emissaries of Jesus Christ. Now, does everyone know what an emissary is? An emissary is an agent who's sent on a mission on behalf of another. But emissaries hold a very high position in government. So if you ever meet someone and they say that they are an emissary, it means that they hold a very high position in whatever government they're from. So immediately when we see these angels who come out and they're in linen, that tells us that the normal position they have is before the presence of God. They minister in the temple that's in heaven. But not only that, with this golden sash around their chest, it tells us that these are emissaries. They have a very high position. So these high-ranking angels are carrying out God's will. This is something very special for them to do, coming outside of the temple to carry out God's will upon the earth. And as they come out of the temple, one of the 4 living creatures hands each one a golden bowl filled with the wrath of God. The word filled indicates that they're filled to the brim with God's wrath. So this tells us that the final plagues are going to be devastating. The earth is going to feel the full wrath of God. In fact, when you read this in the original Greek manuscripts, well, I shouldn't say the original Greek manuscripts, we don't have that, but I'm talking about the original Greek text that comes from the original manuscripts. When you read it, it tells you that it's so filled to the brim that they have to be very careful that it doesn't pour out or spill over. But the whole thought behind that is, these are filled with the wrath of God, and when they're poured out upon the earth is going to feel the full wrath of God. Verse number 8. And the temple was filled with smoke from the glory of God and from his power. And no one could enter the temple until the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were completed. Now, I'll be honest with you. Because Revelation is a book of symbolism, many times we'll read past this and it's like, oh, that's just a really neat thing. But we don't catch the symbolism and what it means. So I want to really emphasize verse number 8. If you don't mind, let me read it again. And the temple, talking about the temple in heaven, was filled with smoke from the glory of God and from his power. And no one could enter the temple until the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were completed. Now, notice what this is saying. As soon as these 7 angels leave the temple, the glory and power of God fills the temple like smoke. And no one is able to enter this temple in heaven until the 7 final plagues are completed. Now, this is not a unique situation. In fact, this very thing has happened twice before. It happened in the days of Moses. In Exodus chapter 40, verses 34 through 35, when Moses made the tabernacle in which God was going to dwell in, the Ark of the Covenant was going to be placed in the Holy of Holies. After this had taken place, God's glory and power filled the tabernacle. It was like a cloud. Now, when you go back and you read it, we can see that you can either describe it as a cloud or you can describe it as smoke. But I want you to notice what it says. Then the cloud covered the tent of the meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled upon it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. It also happened in the days of Solomon. If you remember, when Solomon built the temple, David was not allowed to. In fact, David collected all of the material that was necessary to build the temple. He received the instructions of the Lord in how to build it. Even though it was different than the tabernacle, it was still set up in the same basic structure. It was just more elaborate. And so when Solomon builds the temple, he then comes to dedicate it, and notice what happens. This is in 1 Kings chapter 8, verses 10 through 11. And it came to pass when the priests were come out of the holy place, that the cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud. For the glory of the Lord had filled the house of the Lord. But I want you to notice that each time this happened, the power and the glory of the Lord was so strong that no one could enter into the temple and no one could stand and minister before God. All they could do was fall down and worship God. Now, what this symbolizes, and this is very important, is that no one or no thing can interrupt God's glory and power during this time. In other words, from the time that the 7 angels begin pouring out the wrath of God until the return of Jesus Christ upon the earth, no one can interrupt God's plan. No one can go into the temple and interrupt what he's doing. No one can stand before his glory and power and even attempt to stop the judgments that are getting ready to come. Now, I want you to understand how the Jewish mind would perceive this and see this. When they see that from the time these angels go out with the 7 bowls of God's wrath, and it says a smoke fills the temple, and no one can enter the temple until those 7 plagues are completed, they would understand that don't interrupt God. You can't interrupt him. What God has decided to do is going to take place, and no one can interrupt his plans. It is going to happen. So from the time that the angels step out of the 7 angels step out of the temple until Jesus Christ returns, God is not deterred. He is not impeded. Nothing is interrupted. His will is going to be done. And that's chapter 15.